Whether they pull this down, I guess they will, whether they can pull it down without hurting anybody or without it tumbling down on the M88. I suspect these Marines know exactly what they're doing, but this is going to be kind of fascinating and not a little suspenseful to watch here as we see them try to do something for which this vehicle
now
with its
the
men,
M88
here
is
it
moving
comes.
backwards.
Here they come.
And the big cheers is beginning to move backwards.
Chris, can you make out what those chants are?
Not from here, sorry. There are praises of Allah in the middle of this chanting, definitely. Yeah, I guess what's happening here is that the crew of the M88 is letting out a little more of the steel rope here on the crane, and at the same time moving the vehicle backwards so that, as you mentioned earlier, definitely the vehicle and its crew are also at a safe distance from the statue before it falls. They're just giving it a little more rope before the final snag, I guess.
That picture from Abu Dhabi TV is quite sharp on this, dramatic. I suppose that gesture of his has now become a kind of a goodbye wave, hasn't it?
And Britt,
there's a sort of see you later, buddy feel to this whole thing, isn't there?
Britt, it might be of interest to note that it is sunset in Baghdad, as indeed it is sunset on this regime.
Well, once this thing falls, I guess you can call it a day's work. Yeah, the vehicle is still moving backwards very slowly, very carefully. Obviously, also, the driver wants to make sure that he doesn't roll over somebody's foot who's standing behind the M88, just trying to get a glimpse here.
Chris, does it look to you like those people down by the base of that statue are clear of where it might fall, or are they up too close?
Absolutely, yeah. There's nobody standing there. The U.S. soldiers are making sure there's nobody within that horseshoe there where it's going to drop.
And let's bring in John Scott in Doha. Qatar, who's watching this, John, on Abu Dhabi TV, no?
Well, real quickly, Bridget, Doha, not only the headquarters of Central Command, it's also the headquarters of Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera is carrying these very same pictures, so they are playing all over the Arab and Muslim world. They are seeing the same images we're watching right now on Fox.
There's tension on the rope now. The engine goes. And he's about to fall.
He's tipping.
Oh, it's broken up at both legs right now. But I guess the own weight of the statue is going to take care of the rest very soon. Here we go.
Other shot. Other shot.
This is unbelievable. So there he's hanging.
It's hard to keep the people away. Chris Youngbeld
are throwing rocks at him.
Yeah,
and the pieces of metal, wood, whatever they are, shoes. If the people are throwing whatever they can find, they're throwing it at this statue now from underneath.
Incredible sight.
Isn't that something? They said Saddam would cling to power, and now the statue is hanging on.
The throwing of the shoes, Chris Yumbelt, you can jump in here. You know more about Arabic culture than I do, but there's a certain symbolism in throwing. There he goes. I hope they're watching this all over the Arab Street. Indeed, our own John Scott said that Al Jazeera is broadcasting these scenes. Jubilant seems too mild a word for what you're seeing here as the citizens of Baghdad are on top of this statue. Go ahead, Britt.
I wonder what Dominique de Villepin and Jacques Chirac are saying if they're watching right now.
Dominic, of course, being the foreign minister of France, and his boss, the president of France, who, of course, opposed the liberation of Iraq at every step along the way. And Britt, we should say, who, of course, now want to get back in.
Well, yes, it does. Well, they want through the UN door, which appears to be only ajar at the moment.
John Scott, watching this from an Arabic country surrounding Iraq. Of course, it's one country that happens to be with the coalition, or at least favorable towards the coalition. John, any sign of what the Arabs on the street might be thinking about this as they watch these scenes, which run completely contrary to what they've been told for these many months?
Difficult to assess that from here on the base, David, where CENTCOM is. We're not getting the flavor of the Arab street that you might want at this moment. And of course, the headlines today were about that Al Jazeera journalist who was killed yesterday in that unfortunate incident. But you have to think that there are going to be some minds changed in the Arab world as a result of these incredible pictures that we're watching now. David?
Britt Hume, you mentioned de Villepin and Chirac and the others, Al Jazeera. Do these people who played such a big role in events these past couple of months, do they now become small footprints or little figures in the history of what we're watching right now?
Well, they're not players at all, really. I mean, they were obstructionists in a sense. David, I must say to you, these images of that statue coming down, of those people dancing jubilantly on top of it, and now the hoisting of the Iraqi flag against the pedestal of that statue, this is extraordinarily effective from the point of view of conveying to the world what the administration said and promised that it was trying to achieve. And I mean, I don't think you could, if this had been planned in some way, which manifestly it was not, that we can tell, it could hardly have been more effective, more powerful a message.
Chris Yumbelt, we are looking at people still slapping the statue with anything they can grab hold of, and particularly, and I mentioned this before, their shoes. There is symbolism, is there not, in the Arab world of using your feet or your shoes to degrade, desecrate something?
You do, and it's almost as bad as comparing somebody to a dog, I guess. Yes, this is as low as it gets.
Chris, before
and people are jumping up and down on this statue and hitting it hard and stamping on it. Yes, indeed.
Chris, again, before this statue came down, had you had the opportunity to talk to Iraqis about what this first taste of freedom has felt like for them? It has to be just unimaginable.
It was something that before it all happened, in very, very careful conversations, we've been able to sort of probe as a subject with some Iraqis we have been working with here over the time. Most of them obviously ministry officials who are now gone from the picture, and others like regular drivers, cab drivers who are assisting us here with getting around town and so forth, translators, interpreters also. And it is, for those who are still here, that fact alone, that they can be together with the Western guests, both armed and unarmed, on this day alone is a sign for the fact that they are more than eager to cope with this new situation. But in these conversations we had radically with them in the last 2 hours or so, there is still very much a lack of knowledge and understanding about what really is the potential that is in this country now for each individual citizen. It'll be or somebody here will be able to explain it to all of them. I guess a reestablishment of a mass media can make it.
All right, as Chris begins
top of the agenda.
Chris, you're going in and out, but I just want to bring Britt Hume in once again. Britt, does the power of the liberation that we are seeing now trump all doubts about whether this was the right thing to do?
Well, it certainly does for the moment, David. It would seem to me that this is the jubilation. This is the liberators' welcome that U.S. officials and the administration had expected, and obviously had hoped might manifest itself sooner. But there it is, in the most dramatic possible place, and in perhaps the most dramatic possible way. So obviously this has a powerful effect. There's fighting left to be done, and of course there are many long months, if not years ahead, in which the shape of the new Iraq will begin to emerge, and it will be a difficult task to make that conform to the high hopes that the administration and its allies have had for it. But for the moment at least, something extraordinary and historic has happened. It has happened in a dramatic way, in a vivid way, and with images that technology allows to be sent out all across the world. One small footnote to that, David, I might note that the BBC, which has been criticized by some in Britain and some elsewhere as being hostile to the coalition enterprise here, for some reason, for quite a period this morning, had no picture out of this scene, and they were covering an earthquake in India.
Oh my God! Well, while the earthquake here in Baghdad is such an incredible sight, that's hard to believe.
And we know one thing for sure, that these pictures are being broadcast, the ones that we're looking at, in the Arab world as well. Let's hear more about that from John Scott in Doha, in Qatar. John.
Yeah, Bridget, I just wanted to say, you know, I don't speak Arabic, and I can't tell you exactly how the war has been covered here, but just watching Al Jazeera and some of the other Arab feeds that we're able to catch here in Doha, Qatar, it's been clear that their standpoint has been very sort of anti-U.S. They've carried a lot of coverage, a lot of pictures of civilian victims of the war, and the pictures are very powerful and in some cases quite grotesque. Now, the fact that these pictures that we're watching now are also being carried by Al Jazeera, beamed throughout the Middle East, beamed into countries like Jordan, which has been boiling up with anger over what many in that country perceived as sort of U.S. heavy-handedness. The fact that U.S. Marines and U.S. military people, coalition personnel, the British in Basra, that all of those folks are being portrayed as liberators, as helping the Iraqi people to throw off the yoke of Saddam Hussein. Those pictures are going to be, well, I think life-changing, or perception-changing at least, for an awful lot of people in this part of the world. Back to you.
All right, John. And as we keep an eye on Baghdad, when the camera pulled back a little while ago, Dave, we were able to see some of the cars waiting to get into the heart of the city. No doubt word has trickled at least to other parts of Baghdad. People had to know that this was happening. Maybe people just trying to get in to see the actual toppling of this statue of Saddam Hussein. The
past 5 hours have been perhaps the most extraordinary hours of this campaign, at least from our perspective. Of course, we're not on the ground. The soldiers and the people of Iraq may have other opinions. As we are looking now on the left of your screen at, again, what is probably going to become a footnote to history, very much of one. That is the residence, or it was, it's now blacked out, of Mohammed al-Duri. Let's go back to the live pictures of Baghdad because we can't get that. Mohammed al-Duri, if you don't remember, is the ambassador from Iraq to the United Nations. You saw a lot of him at the UN during the negotiations about whether or not we would do what we have done, whether the liberation of Iraq was necessary. Indeed, of course, he was saying that Iraq had been liberated by Saddam Hussein. Now he is in his residence in New York, wondering, no doubt, where to go. He's certainly not going to go back to Baghdad.
No, and just a hunch here, David, we probably won't be hearing too much today from the infamous Iraqi information minister who's had these unbelievable, literally, statements over the past couple of days. Chris Yumpelt, our man in Baghdad, was saying that he hasn't heard from him, and certainly the reporters in central Baghdad no longer had to bother with the minders following them
Well, news
around.
alert. The information minister of Iraq is probably getting ready to announce that those are not U.S. soldiers in Baghdad.
Right. That's right.
Chris Yumpelt, did anybody in the press corps take those statements from the Ministry of Information seriously? All right. Well, we lost Chris Yumpelt. We can just guess what the answer is. Again, what you are seeing, if you've just tuned in, are the sounds and sights of liberation. The liberation of the heart of the regime of Saddam Hussein. This is a regime of fear. It was based on fear, and apparently that fear is now gone as the people of Baghdad climb on U.S. tanks, on M88s, come and congratulate the soldiers that have come into that town to liberate them, and they are being welcomed as liberators.
And as we continue to watch the pictures on the right of the toppling of the statue, the toppling that was, on the left, we've been looking at pictures of a building on fire in Baghdad. We've been told that this is the Ministry of Finance. And again, over the past couple of days, we've seen such amazing pictures from Baghdad of American troops in the former places of power of the Saddam Hussein regime, but no picture is more powerful than the ones on the right of your screen this morning, with the U.S. troops helping the Iraqis pull down a 20-foot-high statue of President Saddam Hussein. One man actually taking a sledgehammer right to the marble underneath the statue. Scenes, as we've been saying, reminiscent of the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall.
We've been wondering, guessing about how the Arab street, Arabs in the rest of the world who've seen this war through the eyes of Al Jazeera and other Arab news services, would take to these particular sites. Our own Simon Marks has been covering that for this whole campaign, first from Baghdad itself, and then when he had to leave Baghdad, he moved next door to Amman, Jordan, where the Arab street has been quite hostile to coalition efforts in Iraq. Simon, what do you think the Arab street is thinking about what they see now?
I think we're in for an interesting evening here in Amman, David, and an interesting day tomorrow. John Scott in Doha was suggesting that the pictures that we've just witnessed could bring about a perception change in this region. I think they will certainly contribute to a perception change in this region, but I think it's going to take more than just pictures of statues toppling and people in Baghdad celebrating, because there is still in this part of the world enormous concern about the way in which these events have come about. We were talking earlier about the similarities between these events and the events back in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Those were sort of real examples of people power. Many people in this region will point out that this is not pure people power. It is people power that is being influenced, choreographed, they will argue, by United States forces that have entered Iraqi territory. And many people here, I think, will remain very opposed to the notion of the U.S. government installing some kind of administration in Baghdad without getting enormous amounts of input from the Iraqi people. There are huge questions that have been raised at government level here, as well as on the Arab street, about precisely what happens the day after these statues fall. David?
Simon, I mean, there is a certain ridiculousness to that point of view, particularly if you look at other liberation efforts in history. I mean, the French were unable to liberate their country without the help of Allied forces. Indeed, most of Russia and the rest of Europe was unable to liberate itself without the help of Allied forces. Do they not understand that when the bad people have the guns, you need some help from the outside?
David, I completely understand the point you're making, but I think on the Arab street in this part of the world and in other parts of the region, they do not and have not thus far viewed this as a war of liberation. They have, for the most part, viewed it as a war of occupation that they believe is inextricably linked with American support for Israel and with a desire by the United States to establish a dominant position in the Middle East. Now, in order to bring about that perception change that John was talking about, there's no question these pictures tremendous help, but there's going to be an enormous amount of public diplomacy required in this part of the world and across this region to try and persuade people here that they've been wrong, that this genuinely is a liberating move by the United States and not what many people here believe, which is an attempt by the United States to enslave the Iraqi people. David?
You just wonder how many of these pictures the Arab Street will need to see before anything will convince them.
It'll be interesting how they interpret them, but they are seeing them nonetheless, as we've been hearing from our own John Scott in Doha in Qatar. John?
Bridget, a couple of thoughts about two men that you've been talking about, wondering about the whereabouts of the Iraqi ambassador to the United Nations and also the Iraqi Minister of Information, Mohammed, I've lost his name for the moment, but you know the guy I'm talking about. He and his group of minders simply didn't show up for work today. As recently as yesterday, they were making those statements that astounded so many people, saying that U.S. forces were not in Baghdad when it was quite clear that we were in the center of the city. He may have actually had to believe those comments himself, or he may have felt that it was suicidal for him to say anything else. And it's one of the questions that's going to be interesting to get the answers to in the weeks and months to come. Exactly how much did Saddam Hussein know about how his military forces, how badly they have been doing in this campaign? Saddam has been known to literally shoot the messenger who brought him bad news in the days now gone by. And people who brought him bad news were summarily executed on the spot. So the fact that the information minister was saying everything's fine, there are no U.S. troops here, they're committing suicide at the gates of our city, that should not be any surprise. It'll be interesting to see if he survives this campaign, what he has to tell to the historians. Back to you.
All right. Once again, a lot of questions about what the rest of the world is seeing. As Britt Hume was reporting, BBC actually was broadcasting during some of this, reports about an earthquake in India when history was being made. But Britt Hume, I was talking to Simon Marks about whether the Arab Street will finally come to accept this as a liberation. There is diplomatic work that has to be done in order to convince them. What needs to be done by the United States from now on?
Well, a couple of things, it seems to me, David. One is, of course, much will depend on how the leaders in some of these countries react and what they will say about these images. This would seem to be an opportune moment for someone like the king there in Jordan to step up and have a word to say. He's got a resistant population, as Simon Marks has pointed out. The newspapers and the other media in that part of the world have absolutely been drenched with pro-Iraqi propaganda, and that, of course, has affected the population's views. That is something that leaders in those countries can do something about. One would sense, perhaps, that this would be a time for Hosni Mubarak in Egypt to have something to say about all this and what it means, buttressed as he would be by these pictures. Perhaps in Saudi Arabia, even Saudi Arabia, which has been helping us on the one hand and dealing with a population on the other that has been quite hostile to us. Perhaps Saudi Arabia's leaders would like to have something to say at this point. And perhaps even we can dare to hope that some of the state-controlled media, or at least the media that operates within the boundaries set by the state in those countries, would begin to say something about the truth of this mission, which many of those governments know to be the case. So these are all things to hope for. In the meantime, we are continually reminded from Amman and other capitals that, oh no, the only way you'll ever get the Arab Street to side with America is by a solution to the Palestinian issue. That is the refrain that always echoes, that is the fount of all the trouble here. You know, it's strange, David. I somehow did not think that those people there in Iraq were dancing on that Saddam statue because they had suddenly today renewed hope for a solution to the Palestinian problem. It just didn't seem to me that was part of what they're thinking. And of course, all the rest of those countries in the region have an issue here, don't they, which is that they are not free societies, most of them. They are not true democracies, almost, except for Turkey, really, almost any of them. And if there's an outbreak of freedom and dare I say it, democracy in some of those countries, or in Iraq, some of those countries may begin to feel the foundations of their regimes, if they can be so called, begin to shake. So they do have a dilemma, don't they? And a lot will depend on how they respond.
Indeed. One area of the world that you left out, and when you were saying I dare to hope, I thought you were going to be referring to the French and the German foreign ministries. Any chance they'll come along?
Well, David, remember this about those places. They have free press. And while they may be biased in one direction or another, they're not like the state-controlled media. I mean, the people in Germany and France are going to read that and are going to see these pictures. I'm sure they're available on French television now. It's about, it's late afternoon in those countries. They'll come home to the dinner hour, and they're going to see these things. And the general satisfaction and joy of the Iraqi people, as it spreads, and it seems to be spreading, will be known in those countries, and their politicians, I think, will be affected by that. Whether Jacques Chirac and Dominique de Villepin, having climbed as far out on the limb as they have, will be able to find a way back remains to be seen. They certainly don't seem disposed to be trying. And of course, you have this interesting summit meeting that's going to occur over the weekend in, I guess it's in Moscow, isn't it? Where you're going to have Putin and Chirac and Schroeder all gathering together in some sort of a council of who knows what about what's going to happen to Iraq now. And of course, they'll no doubt come out with a list of communique and statements about how it's all going to be. The problem is they don't have any divisions on the ground, and one will ask the question that was once asked about the Pope. How many divisions do they have? Well, the answer in their case, of course, is none, and the U.S. and Britain, I think, will be the principal policymakers here for a time. They have a separate challenge, of course, to Iraqi-ize, to coin a term, this after-war effort as quickly as they can.
All right, Bert Hume just talking about what the reaction might be in the Arab world. Let's get some more perspective on that from Amman, Jordan. And Simon Marks is there. Simon.
Yeah, Bridget, just picking up on what Britt was saying about the role Arab leaders might play here. King Abdullah here in Jordan has been, in the words of senior government ministers here, walking a tightrope, they believe, between trying to balance their desire to maintain friendly, positive relationships with the United States and trying to respond to that restive population that Britt referred to down on the Arab street. We've spoken in the past 10 days to two senior government ministers here, both of whom are very close to King Abdullah, and they both expressed the same sentiment about this notion of exporting democracy from Iraq to the rest of the region. They said at the end of the day, from their perspectives, this is them reflecting their viewpoint, that the United States can build in Iraq a gleaming modern democracy with a thriving capitalist economy, but they believe that unless the fundamental issue of Middle East peace is resolved, unless the Palestinian conflict is addressed by the United States government front and center, they think that at the end of the day, what's happening in Iraq will, for many people in this region, still be irrelevant.
Well,
look at
what's happening in Iraq is that the Iraqis are actually riding a hobby horse on the head of Saddam Hussein. Of course, that's a figurative head. It's the statue. But as the Iraqis are spreading throughout the capital, throughout Baghdad, cheering not only the U.S. soldiers, but the downing of the symbols of the Republic of Fear, we want to take it right now to Mike Emanuel at the Pentagon. How are they observing all this, Mike?
Well, David, as you might imagine, U.S. military personnel watching the scene play out on live television of the Saddam statue coming down. We've seen a lot of smiles around this building. Obviously, the many people who work in this building have been putting in a lot of long hours during the war and in the time leading up to the war, so this is indeed good news. They've also enjoyed watching the reception that a lot of our forces have gotten in Baghdad. It is important to note that there is still fighting going on inside Baghdad. We can tell you there's been some resistance around the area of Baghdad University, where the U.S. Marines are, and also where U.S. Army soldiers are in western Baghdad. There have been pockets of resistance as well, but seeing that shot, General Richard Myers, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, came walking through the Pentagon briefing area as that was playing out on live television and appeared to be all smiles. It is important to note we will hear from Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and also General Myers in about an hour and a half, so we can get their true reaction live on camera. But overall, a lot of smiles here, a lot of people very happy that the plan has gone very well in most regards here. And we can tell you that, obviously, though, with a lot of U.S. personnel and also coalition personnel still in a very dangerous area, there's still a very businesslike approach here at the Pentagon. The feeling is there's still a lot of work to be done. But overall, a very happy morning here at the Pentagon. And again, we'll hear from Secretary Rumsfeld and General Myers in about an hour and a half.
All right, and certainly live coverage of that. Mike Emanuel with the preview from the Pentagon. And speaking of a business-like attitude, just to mention this, Ari Fleischer, the White House spokesman, has been commenting through the morning, saying, again, trying to express, I guess, cautious optimism, saying that there are still a lot of dangerous areas of Baghdad. There are still areas in Iraq under the regime's control. The war is not over. Let's go back to Doha in Qatar and join up with John Scott once again. John?
Same kind of feeling here, Bridget. Obviously, euphoria at Central Command. General Tommy Franks has been watching some of these pictures, the pictures of the statue coming down, the statue being dragged through the streets by gleeful Iraqis. Those are the pictures that they had hoped 3 weeks ago they would see. I don't think anybody here expected to see them this quickly, but this military campaign, as everyone knows, has gone very, very well and much quicker than a lot of people might have expected. At the same time, a word of caution. They note that Tikrit has not yet been penetrated to any effective degree by coalition forces. That is Saddam Hussein's hometown. There is a lot of fighting yet to be done. There are a lot of questions yet to be answered. What happened to those missing American POWs, some of whose uniforms may have been found at that military airfield in Baghdad yesterday? There were American uniforms found. There were names on those uniforms. Not clear whether they are the uniforms of the 507th Maintenance Company, those 7 POWs who we know are in Iraqi hands. So obviously, a great joy here in Doha, Qatar at Central Command as they see these pictures that are being played out live all over the world. But also the sobering responsibility of knowing that there are battles yet to be fought. There may be casualties that lie ahead, and there is a lot of ground still to be covered to fully liberate the people of Iraq. That's the latest from Doha, Qatar. Back to you in New York.
All right. By the way, as we are looking at Iraqis in Baghdad, there are a lot of Iraqis around the world as well, Iraqis who fled the regime of fear, the Republic of Fear of Saddam Hussein. There are anywhere from 20 to 25 million Iraqis in country. Nobody's sure exactly how many because, frankly, people are afraid to tell, or people were afraid to tell the officials of Saddam's government exactly how many people were in the family. Also, when people died within Baghdad, they were afraid to tell the government officials that family members have died because they wouldn't get as much ration as if their family member were still alive. So it's unclear how many people there are. What is clear is that there are 4 million Iraqis outside of Iraq. The question is how many go back to Iraq now to help in rebuilding the country. Our own Simon Marks is in nearby Amman, Jordan. Simon, there must be a lot of Iraqi expats in Jordan itself. Do you hear of many who are saying they're going to go back after Saddam?
Yeah, there is a significant community here in Amman. We had actually witnessed in the past few weeks many Iraqis heading back, at least 5,000, they said, to join the struggle to repel the American invasion. That's what they said at the time. One wonders if, in fact, that was their true motivation. There are other Iraqis here. Remember, Jordan and Iraq had enormous trade links even before this war began, and after this war is over, Jordan very keen to see those trade links exploited to the full, because the Jordanian economy is very reliant on its economic relationship with Baghdad. So I suspect there will be many business people here, both Iraqi and Jordanian, very keen to get back in there. If I can just pick up, David, briefly on that thought you had about the Republic of Fear. I was thinking a little bit earlier on today as we saw these pictures developing live about one young Iraqi government official that we actually worked with in Baghdad a few weeks ago. He was about 25 years old, working for the Ministry of Information in the pay of the government, and quietly over lunch one day he basically opened his heart and said to me, you know, in this country fear is our food. And watching these pictures today, I'm wondering where he is now and what he's thinking. David?
All right, Simon, we're going to go back to John Scott now.
In Doha, Qatar. And John, understand you have a guest with you.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4.
That's right. Yeah, wanted to bring you up to date on just sort of the military perspective on what we're seeing here. These incredible scenes of Saddam Hussein being toppled by the citizens of Baghdad. Group Captain Al Lockwood is the spokesman for British forces here in Doha, Qatar, at CENTCOM Forward Headquarters. Just give me your thoughts to the scenes that we have been watching on television today.
Quite amazing and uplifting, John, to actually see the citizens of Baghdad pull down that statue. It must be a symbol to them that Saddam's regime is over, that he can no longer hurt them, that the coalition forces are there to help them with that small act, an act which must give them confidence in their own future.
And it has been pointed out that there are pockets of the city that are not experiencing this kind of jubilation, pockets where there is not a great amount of coalition military presence. And until you really get that presence throughout Baghdad, I suppose those areas are going to be somewhat subdued.
Yes, you're right. I mean, there is no command and control from the center of the ex-regimes out to the military units. They're acting very much as
I think the speed of what we've maneuvered our troops, we moved them right underneath the area of weapons of mass destruction.
Is it scary that they didn't get the chance to do what they might have done because we moved in so quickly? Does that worry you, that they might unleash holy hell on us at some point, or do you think that that's really just not a possibility at this point?
No, I think there's the possibility remains still in the north. We still have a battle in the north, and you know, we'll probably be addressing that during the course of the show, but there's some issues there, and we may be surprised.
Dr. Taylor, let me ask you a question here.
Yes.
Regarding the chemical weapons, how difficult is it to store them and then to get to them? Because let's not forget, up until President Bush essentially gave Saddam 48 hours, he was in the process of hiding. And then to be able to utilize them in defending his country, if that's what he wanted to do, using chemical weapons, he would have to get them. So my question to you is, how difficult is it to hide them and then get them and put them in some sort of form where you can use them as a weapon?
Well, to use them as a weapon, they have to be weaponized, which means they have to be formulated and packaged in a very specific way and loaded into ammunition, a mortar round, an artillery shell, something of that sort. That's not something that you do off the cuff. These agents are very dangerous and lethal, and any kind of a mistake, and the people who are working with these things will be themselves dead. So this takes time to do. So if he is trying to put this package together in a matter of a few days, from storage of the raw chemical agents into ammunition and then deliver them to the unit itself to fire on our forces, this is not going to be something he can accomplish easily in a couple of days, especially if he's gone through a lot of trouble to hide these things in bulk quantity elsewhere.
And also, Captain Christian, at a point where he's trying to defend his country and he seems to be losing very badly and has got guys scurrying around, that would complicate his efforts as well, wouldn't it?
That would, and the fact that, again, the speed, you have to think of the speed. There's only traditionally two ways to deliver your weapons of mass destruction. One is air, and they have no air power. Number two is the artillery. Artillery traditionally has a trajectory, so if you don't want to injure your own personnel underneath, so they need a certain trajectory, and you're talking a certain range that the troops have to be outside the city there, and we actually moved the troops so fast, so quickly, in and around Baghdad that we may have caught him off guard, and he may have been going into a contingency plan when we caught him and blew him up.
But as you mentioned a moment ago, what we don't know, or what we don't know as much of, is what's going on in the north.
Correct.
How much does that scare you? We know that there's going to be some fighting going on. We're talking about Mosul, Kirkuk, Tikrit, which was Saddam's birthplace. What about the fighting there and the possibility of some kind of nasty chemical being unleashed in the north?
And that's a great issue, and that would be the chilling, shocking effect while all this jubilation is going on, to all of a sudden have our expectations shattered and dashed by we move around Baghdad. Now we're going to have to either take troops from Baghdad and the securing of Baghdad, or the 4th ID is almost ready to move into position to take Tikrit. We have the 173rd with the coalition forces, and that is we're using the indigenous personnel, the Kurds, and special forces. And so they're moving down. We've got a bunch of paratroopers coming down there, and they're moving towards Tikrit. And I think if anything's going to happen in terms of chemical weaponry, in terms of Republican Guard, in terms of a real army and a real war, that's where it's going to happen.
You think there's any danger that in Baghdad there could be remnants of Saddam's regime who are either loyal to him or trying to defend themselves and actually have access to something where they could actually use them there? Or do you think that that risk is gone?
I've been in conflicts where the people during the day have the greatest smiles, they're the most wonderful people, and at nighttime they change, their personality changes, and they get into a car, and in the trunk it could be full of different chemicals which can be mixed and become a weapon of mass destruction. So I think we have to be cautiously optimistic for a short period of time here.
Hey, Dr. Taylor, I've got one more question for you.
Yeah.
You know, people always say that when your back is against the wall, you're likely to do something desperate. And I'm hoping that whoever's left in Iraq, wherever they are, they wouldn't do that. But just one final point. Do you think it's realistic or not that they could unleash some kind of weapon before all is said and done in the coming weeks? Maybe, you know, maybe they'll wait a few weeks to do something.
That's certainly a possibility. We really don't know. Our intelligence people are certainly trying to locate these munitions and to deal with them, to even identify units that might possibly be assigned to use these weapons if that's the case. But what they do and how they carry it out is still open to a lot of speculation, and it's to the point where we can speculate upon speculation. At this point, we've been reasonably successful, and as the captain pointed out, in moving very rapidly. In fact, it's classic blitzkrieg, lightning war, as the Germans would call it, and the speed with which we've moved has probably thrown them off balance for anything that they might have tried to do. If we can continue that into the north as well, that may also work to our advantage. But as far as what they're going to do with these chemical weapons, your guess is as good as mine, if they have them and if they want to use them.
Yeah, Captain Cushing, this was my theory, that initially Saddam didn't use any because he was still thinking that the UN would rescue him, that if he didn't use them, and somehow the Arab world, the Muslim world, would respond to him and the UN would come rescue him, he would never have to use them. Then when he wanted to use them, it was too late.
Many folks have postulated that theory. You know, many scholars have postulated that theory. They felt that the theory that you just put forward, that the U.S. forces would surround the Republican Guard and not stop. I mean, they would not just go through like a hot knife through butter, as the good doctor just pointed out there. They were going to stop, and when they stopped, that would give time to Saddam, and at that time he was going to make this appeal to the Arab world. Right. And in making this appeal for intervention and making this appeal to stop the war, for a ceasefire at least, for a number of days. Ceasefires are not unusual in wars, and enemies often ask for ceasefires. So he never had a chance to ask for the ceasefire. The United States, once the President of the United States said, okay, you know, we're going to war in 48 hours, you have 48 hours, he meant it. And the rest of the Arab world knows now, the rest of the whole world knows now, George Bush stands by his word, and you know, if he gives you 48 hours, it's going to be high noon.
And the speed may have changed everything.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right. We have to leave it there and take a break. Eric Taylor, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to go live to the region when Fox News and Network America Trust for Fair and Balanced News returns.
Scottrade, we're all about value. The value of over 165 branch offices and each Scottrade customer being able to call their personal broker instead of a call center. The value of free streaming quotes and charts with integrated trading. Or the value of trading online for just $7. In activity fees, Scottrade doesn't have any. No pressure to trade. Call 1-800-SCOTTRADE or visit us at Scottrade.com. Because at Scottrade, we're all about value.
Pretty intense, isn't it? For in-your-face home theater action, come to Best Buy. From Sony Plasma TVs to Bose Surround Sound, we'll help find the system that's right for you. Get into the action at Best Buy.
Code, we've got a teacher who wants to go to Hawaii this summer, has a tight budget, and can leave anytime in July. Destination Orbits.
She could use my molecular transporter, but I'm still waiting for government approval. Until then, there's my revolutionary new Flex Search. It's the most powerful low-fare search ever created.
Our teacher will be sipping Mai Tais in no time. Another mission accomplished, Code.
Fox News Channel first.
Military vehicles just outside every prominent Iraqi government building. Hard to imagine how the Iraqi government can really function right now.
Well, for those of you who watch Fox all the time, we know there are a lot of you out there. We always love it when Rick Leventhal calls in via video phone. Right now, he is in Baghdad, east of downtown, and he is now with the 1st Division, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines. Hi, Rick. What you got for us right now?
We have a haircut in progress. Lance Corporal Torres is getting his head shaved. Do you know that he didn't just take a little off the top? He took it all off?
Took it all off, sir. I'm aware of that, sir.
It looks like he's using a face razor there on your head.
Is he? It kind of hurts, sir. So.
It hurts?
A little bit, sir.
Yeah.
He's pulling.
But that's the look you're going for?
For the moment, yes, sir.
How do you feel about the way things have happened? Did you see the pictures of that statue coming down? Did you hear about it?
I actually haven't, sir. But
you feel like this thing is coming to a close and you can go home soon?
I hope so. I mean, the sooner we get to the center of Baghdad and get it done with, we can go home. But I think it's going pretty well so far. I think we'll go home pretty soon.
Did you ever think you'd be live on television getting your head buzzed?
Never.
Well,
yeah.
Well, he's doing one heck of a job. It's Sergeant, right? Yeah. Sergeant Brott is the barber, and when he's now so I should say Lance Corporal Torres is not a reservist. He's active duty, but most of the 223 are reservists, and Sergeant Brott is the manager of a California pizza kitchen when he's not cutting hair. Yeah. And I know you were wondering how your stock's doing. If anybody back in New York can check on the CPK stock while we're doing this and get back to him. He's very anxious to find out if he's making any money while he's here. I know you're doing more than cutting hair out here, and things have been a bit hairy at times, pardon the pun. Wait. CPK up 0.04 to close at? To close at what? 18.96.
Hey, Rick, who's telling you that?
Oh, you just ruined his day. Someone in my ear is telling me that. I guess Dan Cohen. Sergeant, what are your reflections after? These guys were all watching, I should say, on our video phone, a lot of these guys, as that statue was brought down, and there was a lot of smiling out here.
Yeah, it's definitely a rewarding thing to see. You know, the people starting to come behind us and help us out and, let the world see that once he's not here to control what they're saying, looks like they're for us, and more people we got behind us, the easier it's going to be. Hopefully it comes to a close pretty soon.
Were you at all jealous that other Marines were doing the work out there and you weren't able to pull that thing down yourself?
No, we're all a team, so it works the same way. Everybody does their part.
You guys are so politically correct. It's just incredible. They are not done out here by any stretch. They spent yesterday walking through this east side of the city, going block by block, trying to clear out any pockets of resistance, actually trying to draw fire from bad guys so they could shoot back and get rid of the bad guys. And they found, in this area where we're standing now, they found at least six anti-aircraft weapons, and they told me 10 buildings filled with munitions. They also found caches of weapons in other sites around here, including inside a school where they say they found 10 rooms filled with explosives. A lot of the stuff is being blown up. Last night, as we were going to sleep, they were just destroying these anti-aircraft guns over here, blowing them up with C4 one after another. And they're trying to get rid of this stuff so it can't be used against them down the road. They're going to continue with this this security sweep, this urban patrol, trying to make sure that the rest of Baghdad is cleared of these kinds of munitions and these kinds of weapons. And one other note, we were shot at last night, or at least there was incoming fire. We slept over in this area here, this sort of courtyard between these two buildings, and we saw the tracer fire going right over our heads. There were a couple of Marines with another company. We're with Echo Company right now. A couple of Marines with another company out here were injured and medevaced out of here. But have you guys heard an update on the injuries?
Apparently, it was one Marine shot in the foot.
One Marine shot in the foot. All right, so we presume he'll be okay. But the bottom line is there is still danger here, and while things do seem better, they're not all better. So the work continues. Laurie? Bob?
Yeah, Rick, Bob here. It sounds like, you know, Saddam Hussein knew that we would not purposely target schools, hospitals, mosques with any kind of bombing. And it sounds like we've found a lot of weapons in schools. So my question is, are your guys purposely looking in schools, hospitals, and also mosques?
Oh, yeah.
And if it is mosques, do they get any kind of resentment from the locals?
I don't know about the resentment, but I do know they have extremely good maps. They have targets and sites picked out well ahead of time that they want to check out, and many of those sites are hospitals and schools and mosques. They found a trailer at a mosque, parked next to a mosque, and behind it, that was covered with a tarp that was loaded with explosives. They have found similar things at hospitals, and I mentioned the school. They are looking at all these sites as well as government facilities, government buildings, Ba'ath Party buildings, Republican Guard headquarters, and they're finding stuff there too. You know, but in many cases, they're finding the stuff very close to military bases. Like, they won't find necessarily the explosives or the munitions at the base itself, but in homes and buildings right outside it. So these guys were moving it off the base into a house next door, figuring that wouldn't get attacked, but the base would, and then they could return fire. This is where they're finding this stuff. And this place is a construction site. I don't know if you can see it because we got some stuff in the way, but a construction site with homes being built, and back there you might see that anti-aircraft weapon upside down. They knocked them over, they blew them up, but there are half a dozen scattered amongst this site, and inside some of these unfinished homes is where they found a lot of other munitions. So they're doing these searches on a very careful and very focused basis, and those searches will continue.
Hey, Rick, any idea what you're going to be doing next?
Yeah, I do. We're going to a pretty important neighborhood later today to do a similar sweep. They may or may not find the same kinds of things that they're finding here, but I think that they're also looking for intelligence. They're also looking to talk to some locals and find out what they can about where some of the people are who they want to talk to. But it is an ongoing effort now to ensure that remaining forces loyal to Saddam Hussein are taken out, and that's the goal right now for the 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines.
Hey, Rick, it sounds like this is a daytime operation you're talking about, and I know you've done your share of nighttime. Can you tell me why the change?
Well, it's easier, I guess, to search in the daytime, but maybe talk to some of these Marines over here. How you doing?
I'm all right, sir.
Give us your full name and where you're from.
Lance Corporal Christopher Norris. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri.
St. Louis. You're going to be doing some daytime operations, and you have done daytime ops in the past, but also some nighttime. Do you prefer one over the other?
Daytime, because, well, you know, I'm a motor T operator. I'm a driver. Driving at night really does stuff, you know, as far as,
yeah.
MEGs work something on the eyes, and Sandman just comes in and is constantly fighting you.
Sandman. And the problem with the MEGs, as I understand it, is if other people are using lights, then it kind of blinds you.
It actually does. It's like basically riding, and all you're seeing is like just bright. It's just like completely bright.
Yeah, I'm guessing. Thank you. I'm guessing that the daytime operations also are helpful for you guys, like carrying the heavy weapon there. You prefer to work during the day?
Yeah, visibility is a lot better in the daytime, but it works both ways. They can see us, we can see them, so it all varies.
Is there a reason why you do some things during the day and some things at night?
It depends on the mission, really. It's a daytime, more visibility again, like we said. Nighttime, if we want to get more element of surprise, we'll use nighttime. It all depends.
Now, are you a reservist?
I am a reservist.
What's your full name? Where are you from?
My name is Artemio Carranza, over from San Jose. I'm a corporal here at the Marine Corps.
And what do you do when you're not on active duty?
I'm not on active duty. I was working at Stanford Medical Center.
Okay, you're a long way from Stanford.
Quite a long way.
Yeah. Are you anxious to get back?
Very.
You want to say hi to anybody?
I got a little girl at home named Adriana Carranza. Pretty anxious here when I get back.
All right. How about you? You're nodding your head. I know you want to say something.
Yeah, I was just happy he got to say something to his little girl. I know he's missing her a lot. I just want to say hi to my mom, Nicole, my mom, Patty, my girlfriend, Nicole, my little brother, Alex, and my stepdad, David.
Give us your full name.
Brandon Austin.
Brandon, where are you from?
Vacaville, California.
Yeah, you're looking forward to going home too, I guess, huh?
Absolutely looking forward to going home.
As far as today's operation, we don't want to say where we're going. We're not supposed to report that kind of thing. But are you anticipating resistance? I know we've been seeing it in the past.
There's been substantial sniper fire. Is the most resistance we've had that I've seen in a couple of days being in Baghdad. Anticipating any more than that? Hard to say. I don't know how many other units have been through the portion of the city, if any at all. So I think that kind of dictates whether or not the resistance is greater or not.
Okay. The one thing is, Bob, the other part of that answer to your question is that the snipers do seem to come out at night. They do seem to wait till dark so they can hide their movements and hide their position. And that may be one reason why they're doing what they're doing today during the daytime, because if someone is shooting at them, they'll be able to see that person a lot easier.
Anybody, by the way?
I'm sorry, I missed that question.
Yeah, did you want to say hi to anybody?
Do I want to?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if anybody's awake who I want to talk to.
Yeah, Rick,
but,
I hope your two little girls are in bed
if my
by
girl's
now.
watching, no, yeah, my two daughters are definitely sleeping. But if my other girl's watching, you know I love you, baby, and I hope to be home soon.
Oh. Wow, I think we all just had the same reaction. We all just went, oh. Hey, Rick, before we let you...
You know, we've been gone almost 8 weeks. It's been a long time. We've been through some serious stuff out here, too. So, I mean, I completely understand what these Marines go through so much better now. You know, they're gone at times for 6-month tours. These guys have been, their reservists have been called up on active duty, and they've been on active duty for 16 months. And, I mean, that's an incredibly long time for reservists to be on active duty. Some of them able to go home on the weekends when they were back in the States, but some of them, you know, weren't, and now they're here. They weren't even prepared in many cases to be called up, and once they were, to be called up for this long, it's just an incredible stretch of time. So my 8 weeks pales in comparison to their 16 months. My hat's off to them. But I'm going to keep it on right now because I haven't got my hair cut yet.
Yeah, are you going to get your head shaved next? Hey, Rick, quick question for you.
Yeah, I'm this close. I'm this close. Go ahead.
Well, perhaps Roger Ailes would prefer you keep it the way it is. Who knows? Let's remind everybody that this is the first time in recent history that you have Marine reservists serving in the infantry.
Yeah. They're the only, by the way, I was told there were 9 infantry battalions, reservist infantry battalions in the U.S., and they're the only one of the 9 that was called up to serve here. So it's an honor, and they were glad to do it. I think that their performance after 9/11 was one of the reasons why they did call them up, because they had served so well. So they decided to bring them over here. You guys. Do you consider it an honor to be here?
It's definitely special for us, being that no reserve infantry battalion is out here. So there's a lot of eyes on us, and we are out here to obviously do our best and perform and go home. And there's high expectations on all of us, and we want to perform well.
You have now grabbed a place in history.
I think so. Maybe not thinking about it out here. We still have a lot of more work to do to get home safe. But once we get home, we'll realize what we've actually accomplished.
Do you have a sense of what you've accomplished, what you are accomplishing, and what it means in the big picture?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the fact that we are reserved. Normally, we don't get a chance to come out here and do this kind of thing. And the fact that we're privileged to be actually come down here and serve our country and defend it as best we know how. So we're called up here, so here we are. So definitely.
How about that? It's amazing. Just amazing.
Rick.
Hey, Rick, we got Captain Christian here. He has a question for you. Go ahead, Captain.
Rick, I know you're moving out soon, and
Go ahead.
I know I want to ask you a tactical question here in the sense that the East, is that traditionally more friendly to the Saddam, and the west of the Tigris, is that where we have Greg Kelly over there on that side? Are they the enemies of Saddam, or is it vice versa? Many people are asking the question, which neighborhood is Saddam's neighborhood in terms of support?
Well, my understanding is the neighborhood that we passed through yesterday, was fairly anti-Saddam. Was that your understanding? Yeah, I'm getting some head nods. What's that?
Patrolling down the streets, there's a lot of people anxious to see us.
Patrolling down the streets, there were definitely people anxious to see us, is what this Marine's telling me. And I was told that neighborhood was fairly pro-coalition forces in general. And I'm also told that the neighborhood we're going to is not a pro-Saddam neighborhood by any stretch. So, I think that if they're looking for intelligence, they're going to find it there. They'll probably get a lot of help. And that's been a big thing for these guys, is talking to locals who are friendly to the coalition to get information on where the bad guys might be hiding out. And they have gotten a lot of help in terms of fingers pointing, saying, you want to look over here, or you want to look over there. That's where you're going to find them. In some cases, they've actually gone to places thinking that that's where they were, and people would say, no, across the street. Well, and it proved to be correct.
Well, your emails are great, Rick, in terms of people are proud that you're using your sunscreen. They've been worried so much about this sunscreen and Rick over there. So watch the bullets and make sure the sunscreen stays on.
Okay, and the vest is going on, too, as soon as we pull out of this very secure compound.
All right. Be careful, Rick, and that goes for everybody there with you. Thanks, Rick Leventhal, reporting from the east side of Baghdad.
You got it.
And about to go within an hour or so, I think, Lori, on a patrol, or whatever the right term is. Maybe the captain knows the right terminology, but to go out and seek fire and respond, seek out the enemy.
Right. It seems like what they're doing is going neighborhood to neighborhood, seeking fire, but also looking for weapons. And we saw that they found 6 anti-aircraft guns just sitting there by these houses.
Well, the lesson we learned from Mogadishu was when we take a city, to piecemeal it. And we were going to, the Pentagon actually laid this out earlier in the week, that we were going to cut it up in pieces of pie, small pieces or small chunks, and we're going to take bites out of it and secure each one of these little neighborhoods. So the integrated neighborhoods we're going to keep moving through. And there's tremendous caution there, but the great thing that he's pointing out is we're going to get tremendous intelligence. We'll answer questions like you have, and Rick has, and Bob has, about the intelligence of chemical warfare and the intelligence of where the Republican Guard went. Are they up north? Where are they? Are they hiding in the city? Because these people are anti-Saddam people where he's going to meet.
Perhaps we'll learn where our POWs are. That's been a major question tonight.
That's great
Absolutely.
question.
Absolutely. Need to find out where they were.
Yes, we do.
Taken down there, where was it, around Nasiriyah?
Because you know that they're not treating our folks as well as we've been treating theirs.
That's for sure.
Right. Okay. Well, I think we want to recap for everybody.
All right, let's go to Heather Nauert.
Yeah, she's been waiting up on the roof for a long time.
She's been waiting patiently as we talk to Rick Leventhal. She is in Amman, Jordan, and she brings us with the latest from that neck of the woods. Heather?
That's right. Certainly a new day has dawned in Baghdad as Iraqis awakening this morning to a new reality. But U.S. officials say the battle is far from over. Now, still, the Army coming in to the city of Baghdad from the west and the Marines still coming in from the east, and there is much work left to be done. Other parts of the city, including large areas to the north, have yet to be taken by coalition forces. Now, you should be looking right now at a live picture of Baghdad today. It's just about 10 a.m. there, and it's looking fairly quiet right now. However, pockets of resistance have been continuing to fight. U.S. Marines moving through the northeast section of Baghdad earlier today, this morning today, using heavy artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire. But as dawn broke in Baghdad, the fighting quieted down. Now, skirmishes like this in northeast Baghdad and others taking place just hours after Marines and Iraqis worked together yesterday to topple that statue of Saddam Hussein in Firdouz Square. Iraqis, of course, celebrating their newfound freedom once and for all. We're also hearing reports now of looting in Baghdad. These Iraqis perhaps enjoying their newfound liberation, perhaps a little too much. Now, in recent months, we've heard so much in the Arab world about their anger toward the U.S., toward the administration, and the war in Iraq. It seems that they disliked Saddam Hussein and have disliked Saddam Hussein, but dislike the idea of war in Iraq a heck of a lot more. So a lot of people are now asking, how is the Arab world reacting to this news of coalition forces basically doing so well? Well, we're hearing a lot of different things around here. For example, some folks in the Arab world are insisting still to this day that all the video that we've seen, all the hours of video that Rick Leventhal and his crew have shot, has all been a Hollywood production. Now, others are still in complete shock, in disbelief that this has happened, that Saddam Hussein, who beat his chest so loudly, has been, at least for now, it appears, taken down. Others yet are just thrilled at the chance for peace. That's the latest here from Amman, Jordan. We'll be bringing you the latest throughout the day. Back to you in New York.
Heather, let me ask you about this. There was an Al Jazeera journalist who was killed, certainly not targeted, but being in the hotel, there was a response from the coalition forces. And I was wondering if you sensed any anti-American feel where you are as a direct result of that incident.
Well, I would, I've been here for about 10 days now, and I would say that basically the feeling has been tense ever since I arrived, and the folks we work with here have pretty much described the same thing. But things really took it up a notch. That tension really went up a notch once forces got into Baghdad, and of course after the shooting of the journalist who was near and dear to many Jordanians' hearts. His body is now being brought back to Jordan today, so we'll see what happens if there's anything that comes out of his funeral service or just the fact that his body is being brought back. But the Iraqi media had basically been presenting the fact that this person was killed as U.S. forces attempting to take out journalists, U.S. forces intentionally trying to take out civilians, which obviously is not the case.
Obviously, it's not the case. Heather Nauert, thank you very much, and be careful.
Thanks.
All right, well, joining us now to talk more on the fall of Baghdad and future ramifications from San Francisco is Ivan Elan. He's director of the Center for Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. Mr. Elan, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so for the first time in decades, the Iraqi people woke up this morning to the sounds and sights of freedom. Not a small feat, but what concerns you as we move through in the coming days and weeks?
Well, what concerns me is the people who weren't at the rally today to pull the statue down. And of course, there's still a lot of resistance, as your broadcast has mentioned. And I think that in the future, the administration is going to have to be careful that it leaves a light footprint in Iraq. And I think that they may be going the wrong way with this direct military rule, because I think that may inflame passions down the road. It may continue the guerrilla attacks that we see now, and maybe even terrorist type of attacks, or it could regenerate them in the future if the people resent the U.S. presence. And what I mean by that is that we've seen a lot of ambivalence on the part of Iraqis. They want to get rid of Saddam Hussein, certainly, but they also are very nationalist in their feelings, and they feel that, in some sense, the U.S. is not only a liberator, but also a foreign invader, or some have even used the term colonizer. So
but that's
I think
to be
we have
expected, isn't it?
Well, I think so. I think we have to be careful that we don't fulfill that prophecy. If we give contracts to U.S. companies, and if we don't bring in the UN, if we don't, or another, preferably a coalition of the willing to do the stabilization afterwards, I think we can fall prey to the perception in the Arab world, which is already there, that we're doing this for our own gain and not for the Iraqi people.
Well, I think that when the people in the Arab world saw that statue come tumbling down today and saw the looks on the people's faces and the people dragging Saddam Hussein's statue's head through the streets, people throwing their shoes at it, which, as we know, is the ultimate insult in the Arab world, I think that goes a long way, Mr.
Well,
Elan.
I think they were, those people certainly were opposed to Saddam. There are some people who are still fighting who are supporting Saddam, and there's that vast silent majority, as Richard Nixon used to say, and we don't really know what they think, and we don't really know how they'll react to an extended U.S. presence there. So I think it's a little too early, and I think even the administration would say it's a little too early to be gloating over victory. I think we need to be careful in the long term that we don't create a Chechnya 2 situation where we win, but we really don't win.
Mr. Elan, I guess the fear in the Western world, if you will, is that the Arab countries all unite with one anti-West feeling and act on that. Yet don't we know pretty much that whoever ends up running Iraq is not going to be pro-Saddam, and consequently will probably not be pro-Palestinian necessarily, because Saddam was the one paying them for doing homicide bombings. That the new government is not necessarily going to be pro-Iran, whom they had a war with, although you could argue that was Saddam's war. But it's not like there's a unison in the Arab countries, is there?
Well, certainly there is unison in the fact that the polls indicate that they don't like U.S. foreign policy, and that's a problem. And I think it's a problem not just because we care what people think of us, but because the Soviet Union had a problem of being perceived as an infidel in a Muslim land occupying it, and we can run into the same problem. If we run into that problem, we're going to have jihadists from every part of the Arab world and the Muslim world coming to join the remnants of the resistance here. And I think we could also face increased terrorism at home. So I think it's a bit wise to go a little light on this the post-war measures in Iraq, and I think we should bring in the UN or a coalition of the willing to do this stabilization. I don't think we need U.S. forces to stay around that long.
Boy, I don't know about the UN. Why the UN? They really haven't been that involved so far. They haven't really helped us at all. Why on earth would we want them to be involved this time around?
Well, I would prefer a coalition of the willing rather than the UN, but certainly anything is better than the perception that the U.S. has gone in there and is now taking over the place and giving its own companies the oil contracts and the reconstruction contracts. And that's what the Arab world perceives right now. And I think that's the worst possible world from the standpoint of terrorism against our forces there, terrorism against U.S. Here at home, etc. And I think, you know, now once we get the battle done, we need to turn it over to other people.
We also need to get the Iraqi people involved.
Oh, definitely. I think that, and I don't think we're doing that with direct U.S. military rule. That's the principal thing here. We need to turn this over to an international force of some kind who can get the Iraqi people back in control of their own destiny. And I think 6 months of U.S. direct military rule, it's a bad perception, but it's also the fact that certainly our military dictatorship would probably be better than Saddam's. Anything would be better than that, but that's not democracy, and we need to get democracy to Iraq.
Well, we need to be patient. We're just at the very beginning of this, and I think we all just need to be very patient. Ivan Eland, Director of the Center for Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute in San Francisco. Thank you, sir, for your perspective tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we should also remember this war is not over. It has not been deemed over by anybody. There's still people's lives at risk, and we will continue to talk about that. And let's find out what else is going on over in Kuwait City. Steve Centani joins us now with the latest from there. Steve.
Well, good morning. The British continue to tighten their grip on Basra, Iraq's second largest city, as residents of that city went on a looting spree for a second day in a row on Wednesday. Gangs of civilians poured through shops and government offices and abandoned schools. They're grabbing just about anything they could cart away. Furniture seemed to be a popular item. People were seen hauling away desks, mattresses, chairs, and even refrigerators. Local police are no longer on the job, but the British are now beginning to crack down, try to impose some law and order there. They fired warning shots at looters and warned them they could be taken prisoner, and some indeed were arrested. One Iraqi was reportedly stoned to death by locals for stealing from a shop, so some people taking the law into their own hands. At first, there was no control over looters. As one British official put it, it was a calculated gamble to allow people to let off some steam. Meantime, farther north of Basra, in Nasiriyah, Iraqi opposition leader Ahmad Chalabi was mobbed by thousands of enthusiastic Shiites on Wednesday. He told the exuberant crowds that they themselves would choose their next government. Chalabi is the leader of the Iraqi National Congress, an opposition group in exile, and with an eye toward who might take power after a transition, a meeting will be held as early as Saturday between all the different factions, the political factions in Iraq, to try to hammer out some kind of a framework for a future transitional government for that country, now that it looks like the Saddam Hussein regime is history. Live in Kuwait City, I'm Steve Centani. Back to you in New York.
Steve, thank you very much.
All right, well, let's go back to our military roundtable. Fox News military analyst Captain David Christian here in New York. And in Washington, John Pike of globalsecurity.org, who's got the handy-dandy screenwriter in front of him. But Captain Christian, I want to start with you because you're sitting right here, and I've been looking at you for the last hour or so. What about the Fourth ID? We haven't heard much about them. What are they up to?
They are so full of a fight right now and so angry at the Turks because they've been floating on ships for 40 days plus. They've unloaded off these ships and they are moving rapidly, and I was just talking with Bob, and he said, you know, how are they going to be moving? Well, their roads are secure all the way up to Baghdad right now, and they can move at approximately 50 miles an hour, and they're going to be roaring up those roads. They want to either release some of the people from either the 1st Infantry Division, 1st Marines rather, or they want to release some of the folks from the 3rd Infantry Division that are securing Baghdad. We also have troops, the 173rd Airborne, complemented by the 82nd Airborne. We have 75th Rangers that are out in the west that have secured H2 and H3 airfields, and they're coming in. We have the 173rd Airborne to the north. They're coming down. We have Tikrit as a major battle, as you indicated. And I think we just flew in a brigade from the 1st Infantry Division out of Germany, mechanized. So we're ready for a major battle. Whew. And the 4th ID is going to lead that battle, and they're supposedly the most sophisticated, computerized, mechanized, and they're ready. They've taken their gloves off.
Let's bring in John Pike here and add to this conversation. You have the screenwriter behind you, and folks, globalsecurity.org. If you go there, there's so much information. It's amazing, and a lot of us have used that for a great deal of resource information. I know I have. I started studying this weeks ago. John, show us what is on your mind. Add to this conversation here.
Well, I think we've basically got 3 maps that outline sort of the days and weeks ahead that really reinforce what we've been hearing over the last half hour or so in terms of the battle not being over. Organized resistance appears to have collapsed. We seem to be looking at regime change in progress, but Baghdad remains to be pacified. And if we can go to this first map and get a look at exactly how divided up ethnically even that city is, if you think about any major major American city and think about the rich neighborhoods and the poor neighborhoods, neighborhoods with different ethnic majorities in them. That's basically the same situation that you have in Baghdad. We can see where the Marines have been operating over here in eastern Baghdad, an area predominantly of Shiite, the majority in the country, but not well represented in Saddam's government. The U.S. military has been operating from the airport over here and is basically going to be moving through different neighborhoods, trying to understand in the course of the next week or so exactly where the holdouts are, exactly what the level of political support is, and trying to secure all these key facilities to start the interrogation, to try to figure out where the POWs are, try to figure out where the chemical weapons are.
And what about up north? What about up north?
Well, up north, the first place we've got to go up north is to Crete. That's about a 100-mile drive up from Baghdad, and it's not clear who's going to be making that drive, whether it's going to be the units of the 3rd Infantry or the Marines that are already in Baghdad, or whether that brigade of the 4th Mechanized Infantry Division is going to leapfrog over them and go up to Crete. And then even further north, once we've managed to get up to Crete, we still have this front along here where you have Iraqi forces on one side, Kurdish forces on the other side. This was an area of terrible ethnic cleansing by Saddam Hussein's regime back in the 1980s. Kurds wanting to move back in to reclaim their former homelands. Clearly an opportunity for some very nasty payback in the coming weeks unless we're able to reestablish a legitimate civil administration in that area.
Captain Christian, for you, thank you, John. It was very well spelled out there. Thank you. Captain Christian, let me ask you about something that came on our radar, so to speak, today, and that is the Moab, the mother of all bombs. We know now that it is ready for use. We tested it in Florida, I guess, what was it, a couple months ago?
Seems that way.
And I would think that it would have gotten the attention of quite a few people. What are the chances that we would ever actually use something that is 21,000 pounds? Do we need it at this point?
It depends on you know, as John was laying out, this resistance in the north. We have Colin Powell convinced the Turks to stay out. The Turks sent 1,500 troops across the border, and they came back. So he convinced the Turks to stay out because there's such a hatred between the Turks and the Kurds. So now it's just the Kurds and the Iraqis. And there is this line of resistance that's been there for years, and they're well entrenched. The guys that are well entrenched and well equipped happen to be the Iraqis. And they have the anti-aircraft weapons. There's a tremendous number of weapons up there because they have been fighting the Kurds and keeping the Kurds sequestered into their little region there. When we came up from behind them then, they're going to be sandwiched between the U.S. forces to the north with the 173rd and the coalition and special forces, and then from the south they're going to be sandwiched with, I think it's going to be the 4th ID and the 1st Infantry Division, and you're going to have, you know, a situation there. Do we want to sacrifice, as in World War II, do we want to sacrifice a whole lot of men in a major battle because there's an open arena there, or do we want to use, psychologically, drop the Moab, the mother of all bombs, and when we drop this, the psychological effect is, hey, if they have that, what else do they have? And they drop their weapons and they surrender. That's what we'd like to see. So the only reason we would use this Moab is not for the physical damage effect, but for the psychological. And we thought we were going to have to use it outside of Baghdad to make this impression on the Republican Guard, which we couldn't find. So the Republican Guard may be up north. They say there's 10 divisions up there right now and 1 Republican Guard division. In Tikrit and then north of Tikrit, there's an entrenched force of Iraqi soldiers. So we may have to use the Moab in one of those regions.
I don't know whether to ask you this or John Pike. Maybe you both have an opinion, but the Kurds seem kind of like a wild card here. We're using them kind of like we used the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, but they have such a history of being oppressed. Obviously, they're very emotional about this, and they know that they can run their own kind of state independently and successfully, and they're very proud of that. Are they a wrench in this works? Could they be a real problem down there?
Well, I can start, and John can jump in there. Yes, the Kurds can be up fighting in the north with the Kurds, and some people call it Kurdistan up there, but
they do.
And they do. And remember,
which is not a country, just to let people know. There's no such country as Kurdistan.
That's true. Basra with the Brits. If you remember, that was supposed to be, you know, a traditional city. We bypassed it, the U.S. forces did. The Brits had a tough time in that city because of different feelings. And the Shiites were supposed to join us because they were anti-Saddam. And it took a long time to convince the Shiites in Basra that Saddam had fallen. So in the north of the Kurds, they are a wild card because they were promised so many times. In '91 they were promised, prior to that they were promised. Plus they suffered the sacrifices of Saddam's chemical weapons of mass destruction that he showed on national television, where he killed over 5,000 of them in the city, and you saw women and children and bloated bodies. It was such a sad, sickening effect. And he boasted this to the world. He showed this off to the world. So they're a wild card because they don't know really who they can trust. They depended on us once before, and we left them there. So right now our Special Forces has their loyalty. And the U.S. Special Forces, the Green Berets, are very, very skilled in working with indigenous personnel. But only within the last week, we strafed with aircraft a Kurd column with U.S. Special Forces in it, and so we shot up this column here, and we've been making amends on that. So they're hesitant. They're stutter-stepping.
Yeah, John, I don't want to belabor that, but you have, you know, something to add to that?
Well, I think that, you know, quite frankly, we're looking at thus far nearly a best-case scenario with the Kurds, because originally the interest in getting the 4th Mechanized Infantry Division through Turkey was to have a large American military presence in Kurdistan and the northern area.
From the north.
Basically, yeah. I think. Well, and also, I think, to stabilize the Kurdish front and also to discourage the Turks from thinking that they needed to send a large military force in. Thus far, even with only a small American military presence up there, the Kurds have been reasonably well behaved. The Turks have been well behaved. Even though you've had 10 divisions of Iraqi soldiers along the Kurdish front, they've been reasonably well behaved. And I think that it has been nearly a best-case scenario of everyone just sitting back and watching it on TV,
right. So far,
rather
so
than
good.
getting their military forces moving around. Yes.
You know, John, just to follow up with what's going on in Baghdad and then what's going on in the north, when word of what happened in Baghdad today makes it up north, and perhaps it already is because we know that the Arab TV stations have been running these incredible images all day, do you think the expectation is more that the people will rise up and support the coalition troops, or there will be less of a fight than perhaps there might have been had this not happened?
Unavoidably, there are going to be some diehard elements that are going to be sniping at American forces. I think that we have not seen the last of these kamikaze attacks by the technicals. It's really not so much a question of the people rising it up as it is of the army capitulating, of the Ba'ath Party leadership not showing up for work. And I think that the Iraqi ambassador to the United Nations, his bottom line, game over. I think we're going to be seeing a lot less resistance in the next week or 10 days than we have in the previous 3 weeks. But you're certainly going to have to get an American military presence all the way up to the north before you can really say game over.
All right, gentlemen, John Pike and Captain David Christian. Hope to see you a little more coming up. And now we wanted to bring you a dramatic reminder of some of the incredible events from the past 24 hours. Let's take a look at these.
We've got some unbelievable video you've been seeing. This is that square you have seen numerous times where they've got that huge statue of Saddam.
That statue?
And guess who's there?
That's right.
You are seeing history in the making right now. U.S. forces have rolled into the heart of Baghdad.
After an incredible 3 weeks of combat, Operation Iraqi Freedom appears to be living up to its name. We're watching right now as Iraqi citizens literally try to topple Saddam Hussein, or perhaps a statue of Saddam Hussein. They're climbing on the statue. Iraqis themselves are doing this.
Residents of Baghdad putting a noose around the neck of the center statue in Baghdad of Saddam Hussein, wanting to pull down not only the dictatorship, but the symbolism of the dictatorship. One way or another, you're trying to bring down the regime of Saddam Hussein. This guy's doing it the old-fashioned way, the sledgehammer against the dictator. One would think of David and Goliath, perhaps. The heart of the regime, the heart of the country, the heart of the dictatorship appears about ready to fall.
Well, this does really remind you, you saw the guy with a sledgehammer pounding at the base of that statue of the day the Berlin Wall came down. I suppose that gesture of his has now become a kind of a goodbye wave, hasn't it? There's a sort of see you later, buddy feel to this whole thing, isn't there?
And he's about to fall.
He's tipping.
Here he goes.
He's shut out of sight.
Isn't that something? They said Saddam would cling to power, and now the statue is hanging on.
There he goes.
Look at
what's happening in Iraq is that the Iraqis are actually riding hobby horse on the head of Saddam Hussein, cheering not only the U.S. soldiers, but the downing of the symbols of the Republic of Fear.
An amazing day. Well, as a general for the Iraqi National Guard, our next guest, General Fawzi al-Shamari, once commanded 9 divisions for Iraq in the war with Iran. He was also prominently mentioned by some as a possible successor to Saddam Hussein until he defected in 1986. And he is now with the Iraqi Salvation Movement and is a prominent figure in the Iraqi opposition. He joins us now from Mountain View, California. General, really appreciate you being with us. Give us your insight on the happenings of the past 24 hours. What's your feel right now?
Thank you for inviting me, and really it was our dream. We see our dream achieved, and when we saw Saddam's status toppled, that indicates to me that the era of terror and atrocity and brutality is ended, and now it's a new era for Iraqis. It's a history now. Saddam Hussein became a history.
Let me give us a feel for how deep his followers are committed to him. Or do you think now that we see that statue literally toppling, and we don't know where he is, if he's dead or if he's alive, but obviously his regime has lost power, does that mean this is over, or are there people committed to whatever he stood for so that they're still dangerous?
I think when we evaluate that, we have to look what are the major elements for defender. And when we look to Saddam Hussein, he focused on Baghdad as a vital terrain. And when it fails, that means the whole defense collapsed. And it's like the spine for him. If we break his spine, then the body is collapsed. And when he lost his counterattack, because everybody was expecting that Saddam Hussein will do a counterattack using his Republican guards to make a night maneuver to cut the line, the supply line for the Allied forces. But when he felt that, and the air campaign degraded his counterattack force, then he lost the major defense. Whatever left is pockets, but we don't consider the war is over.
At what point, General, would you consider this war over and the next phase would begin, and that is for Iraq to begin rebuilding?
I think when we follow Saddam Hussein and got him with his henchmen, that will be the end of the resistance, the remaining resistance. And from my point of view, Saddam Hussein has many options, either to continue till the death, and I doubt that Saddam Hussein will do that, or will committing suicide because he lost everything. And also I doubt Saddam Hussein to do that because he didn't do it before, or staying more and expose himself for capturing, and he is not doing that. But I think left with one option, escaping and maybe he is planning to escape through the north.
As a general for the Iraqi National Army, you met Saddam Hussein many times. What were your impressions of him? Were you frightened of him? Did you ever feel that if you did not carry out his orders, you would be killed and your family would be threatened?
I think Saddam Hussein, everybody through this period, he's been in the authority for 35 years. Since he focused on three things. First of all, infiltrating the armed forces and creating his army. Second, he controlled this constitution by security forces, and he started to do that. And he creating his own army, the Republican Guard, and he put it as a competence to the National Army. And he focused on these things, and he started, implanting fear within the armed forces. He insulted the armed forces. And the way I see it, I saw him many times, and all my impression, he's an evil, he's a dictator, and he is brutal. He doesn't hesitate to kill everybody. This is why he succeeds in implanting the fear within the armed forces leadership and within the civilians.
Sir, as a general, you fought on behalf of Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war. What compelled you to fight in that war and then subsequently decide to leave the country of Iraq?
The first part of your question, my incentive to fight basically depend on defending my country. Nationalism. We didn't fight for Saddam Hussein, but we defended our country. It's the same thing that I notice the Iraq is doing now. Mm-hmm. They don't fight for Saddam Hussein, but they're fighting for their country. Second thing, the second part of your question is I decided to leave everything and leave the country because I recognize he is extended his brutality. I extended that he started the war against Iran. I started that he distinguished between his people. And one time he was sitting with his Vice President Izzat Ibrahim al-Duri and his leadership. And during a break he asked Izzat Ibrahim, Izzat, what's the population of Iraq? And he answered him, sir, what do you mean? And he insisted on Izzat to answer him. Then finally Izzat Ibrahim noticed that Saddam Hussein is serious. Then he told him, sir, 18 millions. And he waved his fingers and he told him, don't you think that's too much? 5 million is enough for me. From that you can imagine, everybody can imagine what kind of leader did we have.
And this is the kind of man who killed thousands and thousands of Kurds up in the north 13 years ago. The Iraqi people are a very nationalistic people, as you mentioned a moment ago, and perhaps they don't fight for Saddam, they fight for Iraq. What do you think needs to be done to keep the people from turning against each other, particularly the Shia and the Sunnis?
I think I deal with the Iraqis as Iraqis. I don't recognize between Shia and Sunni because all of them, they suffered from Saddam Hussein.
But they have big differences between them, and people are predicting that there could be some infighting. Do you not think that is the case?
That depends on the nature of the coming leadership. We need a strong leadership with the assistance of the United States forces there. And because we are facing now a new stage, and this new stage is more dangerous than the war itself, because this may be leading to dismantling Iraq if we don't do it right. And then to exploit the victory, we have to plan for that, and hopefully we did that before. And in order to keep all Iraqis united and focusing on one goal, that's we have to live under one constitution, one law, and avoiding dictatorship and building a new democratic society.
Are you going to go back, sir? And what would you like to do?
It's my honor to go back to my country and help, in some way, help my people.
Well, good luck to you, sir. We appreciate you joining us tonight and talking with us, General Fawzi al-Samari. And thank you very much and good luck. Thank you. Joined now by filmmaker Joel Solar, whose documentary Uncle Saddam was met by death threats when his film first premiered. And thank you very much, Mr. Solar. Who issued the death threats?
I wish I would know who issued those death threats, but yes, I received several death threats. And actually, you know, the first threat I received, it was from the Iraqi regime. After staying 2 months in Baghdad.
What was the movie about? I guess somebody was angry with you for the movie. What was the movie?
The movie is called Uncle Saddam because the children in Iraq actually were obliged to call Saddam Uncle Saddam, and the movie is being released this week on DVD and on Amazon.com and in stores. So the movie is about Saddam. I spent like 2 months with Saddam interior designers, Saddam architect, Saddam cousin, the best friend of Saddam wife, and it's about Saddam entourage and his lifestyle, and in contrast of the suffering of the Iraqi people.
Joel, what were the most striking things that you learned in your 2 or 3 months that you spent with Saddam and his entourage, and how would you compare that to what we're hearing about him today?
You know, I think the most amazing thing, and I think this is what all the dictators have in common, it's their ego. And, you know, until like recently, Saddam's ego was so big that he thought that, you know, all the Iraqi people will fight for him. And you know, everything and really that's really surprised me when I was in Baghdad, that everything is about Saddam's ego. Even the palaces that I visited, everything has to be huge, and to make sure that, you know, those palaces will stay in history, and you know, the world will remember Saddam Hussein. Even, you know, Saddam rebuilt Babylon, and every 100 bricks he did engrave his name, saying the great Saddam Hussein rebuilt Babylon, to make sure Saddam will be remembered in history. And his ego today lost him because he thought that, you know, people will support him.
I wonder what he would be thinking if he actually saw the statue coming down today, being brought down by the Marines and by his own people. We don't know if he's dead or alive. We have no way of knowing if he saw this. What did you think when you saw this happening today, knowing what you know about Saddam?
You know, I did make clear in my movie that Saddam is a brutal dictator.
But what did you think when you saw this today, sir?
You know, my first, to be honest, I did cry, and I mean, cry of joy. I mean, it's a beautiful day, and I had question until recently, until yesterday, when I saw that some civilian in Al Mansour district were bombed, and but today, you know, for the first time, I thought, wow, I mean, it's amazing. Saddam is gone, and it's a beautiful day, and I think today it's a day of victory. I mean, the war is not over, but still, I mean, it's a major victory. You have to think that those people, they 30 years with Saddam Hussein, and to see those people rising against Saddam in the middle of Baghdad, I mean, it's a major victory.
You are French, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the French government's stance toward what has been going on in Iraq. I don't know where you're living these days. Do you live in the United States? Do you live in France?
I live both in the U.S. and in France.
Well, what do you think of the French government's responses? The fact that first I know you're not a politician, but I have to ask you. You know, France originally supported Resolution 1441. Then, as you know, they became the most vocal opposer to what we were doing, and now it seems like they're trying to get back in the game. I guess I'd just like your thoughts on that.
You know, I mean, as you said, France became the most vocal. It doesn't mean that, you know, because they became the most vocal, they're the only one. I think France, honestly, represented a lot of people and a lot of European, and I did agree with France, who did ask for a few more months inspection. But you know, is the price was worth it of thousands of Iraqi people dying and hundreds of Americans dying?
Yeah, but what about the millions who will be liberated?
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, those people today, it's a beautiful day. So, you know, I don't question that. But, you know, France had a different idea of Iraq, and the US had another way of doing it. And, you know, I don't know what to say. I mean, I'm really happy. I'm really happy with what happened today, and I think we should celebrate that. But as a French foreign minister said today, I think it will be very important that the UN will jump in and have a major role in the new
They haven't
Iraq.
had a major role yet. We'll see if they do in the future. But Joel Soler,
you didn't let the US didn't let the UN as a major have a major role in that crisis.
well, they didn't let themselves in. But Joel, anyway, we appreciate you coming on. It is a day of victory for the people. This war is not over yet, but I think what we saw today is truly historic. People will be talking about this for hundreds of years. Joel Soler?
It is, and we will we have to celebrate that and give credit to the Bush administration.
All right. Thank you. Joel Soler, documentary filmmaker. The documentary is Uncle Saddam. Thank you very much for coming on. We really appreciate your time and your opinion. Thank you.
Let's get out to Rick Leventhal. We talked to Rick less than a half hour ago. They were going to head out on some patrols. Rick, what's going on now?
Well, we were also joking about not having our vests on. Well, we put them on pretty quickly about 20, 30 minutes ago when we heard gunfire, Marine gunfire. And we can show you what they were shooting at. Before I get to that, I don't know, you probably can't hear this, but it sounds like popcorn in the distance. There's some rounds burning off in one of the buildings where they found a lot of munitions, and occasionally you may hear a thump of a larger round. I don't know if it's a mortar or an RPG blowing up, but in any event, that's what we're hearing off in the distance. You may see a Jeep-like vehicle behind a refrigerator-looking type truck. Those two vehicles began rolling. They're military vehicles, and they began rolling past our position. The guys up on the roof up here ordered them to stop, and they didn't stop. They began taking shots at the vehicles. The vehicles still didn't stop, so then I think is that a 50 cal on top of that? 50 cal on top of this 7-ton open fire, and they just riddled that thing with rounds. The vehicles did stop at that point, and apparently because they were disabled by the rounds. And apparently the guy who was driving that vehicle jumped out earlier and took off running, but the vehicle was still idling, so it continued to roll. Let's talk to Corporal Benjamin Lancaster. You were involved in this. Catch you by surprise?
It did, actually. We thought it could have been a truck bomb coming through our lines. We ordered to stop a few times, and it just kept moving, so we opened up on it, disabled the vehicle.
Yeah, you did. We took a close look at it. That thing's not going anywhere.
No, it's not. And there's just shot up pretty good.
There are a lot of military vehicles in this area, and those had been sitting there. What do you think was going through the guy's mind? He knows the Marines are here.
Yeah, I'm not sure what goes through a lot of these people's mind trying to take these vehicles in front of us. That's why when we see these vehicles rolling at us, we got to be extra careful, make sure they're not truck bombs.
I should point out that it's beyond our camera range, but next to one of the other buildings here, there's a Frog missile on the back of a vehicle, and the back of the vehicle looks like one of those car trailers, but it's a launch pad. So there's a Frog missile, I don't know, a couple hundred yards away from us that could have been launched at any time. Is that your understanding?
My understanding was the nights previous to us getting here, there had been anti-air fire here, so it appeared that they were leaving here during the day and occupying this position at night and shooting at aircraft coming over the position, so that could have been launched. There was 2 launchers on the back of the truck, and one had already been launched. So who knows when that one took off.
And that noise in the background as the rounds continue to burn off, does that concern you at all, that there are all those rounds detonating?
No, well, it concerns me that they have that many rounds. That kind of bothers me, but I'm happy that we're destroying them, and we're destroying them in a controlled environment. I mean, there's not much of a population out here, and we do have explosive ordnance over there, and get them disabled and get them out of our harm's way so nobody's shooting at us with them.
I hear the louder explosions. My concern would be that a louder explosion would punch a hole in a wall or something, and then the smaller rounds that are going off would like start come shooting out of there.
That's a potential. I mean, they're probably just as inaccurate as people shooting at us on an everyday basis. So just something you have to live with, something you kind of grow used to.
Corporal Brandon Austin, thank you. Guys, you should know that there are a lot of anti-aircraft weapons also that were disabled here yesterday. The guys blew up. One of them was C4 because it had a bunch of rounds in it and around it. It was on the other side of this building right here. We all stood on this side of the building. The anti-aircraft weapon was blown up on that side, and sure enough, over the top of this building, we just saw chunks of metal come raining over the top. Nobody was hurt, but it was quite a scene. This is one of the things that the 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines is busy doing. They're going block by block, patrolling for resistance, and they're also looking for leftover munitions, and they're finding a lot of it, and there may be much more left to find and dismantle or destroy. Guys?
Hey, Rick, let me ask you, what is the condition of the weapons that you find, including that anti-aircraft weapon? Are your guys impressed by it, or do they look old? What conditions are they in?
That's a good question. Before I ask the question, I can tell you that my impression has been that it's old equipment. They're asking the condition of the weapons that you guys are finding. And it seems to me that a lot of it is old and sort of pathetic looking in some cases.
You would think so. I found a couple crates. A couple crates the other day of fully functional, brand new weapons in a compound that we had searched. The ammo, old or good, old or new, it's not really matter. It's still just as dangerous if it was brand new. They can deploy it just as well.
But you compare the weaponry that the Marine Corps has with some of these anti-aircraft weapons, and you know, it just
we're far superior. Far superior. Their equipment is definitely outdated and old, but just as dangerous.
Yeah, that, you know, the T-72 tanks are 30 years old, but those things are pretty hard to kill, aren't they?
As I understand it, yes. I've only seen a couple, and they've been destroyed, but I still wouldn't want to run up against one.
Yeah. So yeah, it's old, new, but it's being destroyed. Hey, Lance Corporal. Adam Fraser definitely wants to get a shout-out. I promised him a shout-out. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say to my pregnant wife back home, she's about 7 months, Toshima Kuba Fraser, I love you. And all my family back home, my relatives, my friends back in the jungle, I love you all. I'll see y'all soon. And yeah, we're out here in Iraq, but we'll probably be home pretty soon. Looks like the war's almost over.
You went from one jungle to another.
Yeah, pretty much.
What do you do when you're not active?
I was a student at San Jose State.
Looking forward to getting back to school?
Yeah, I can't wait. I'm still a freshman. I should be a senior, but I'll be back in one day, you know.
Yeah, these guys, you know, most of them are reservists, and they've been on active duty for, in some cases, 16 months. So, yeah, anxious is probably an understatement.
Right. All right. Always tugs the heart hearing all these guys saying hi to folks and a pregnant wife. I mean, that gets you. Rick Leventhal, thank you very much. Folks, after the break, more on the military movements and the dramatic events that have occurred in Baghdad. Stay with us.
In the wake of the advance of the American armored columns, the people of Baghdad are taking their first tentative taste of freedom.
This is Joe Waller. He just got Comcast high-speed internet. Not only is it faster than his old dial-up connection, it's twice as fast as DSL. More powerful than DSL. And with this offer, it's a much better choice than DSL. The same DSL his neighbor, Ed, brags about every day. Which makes Joe a lot smarter than Ed.
Call now.